The Nintendo DS, the dual-screened throwback to the early 80s from the mid-2000s, with a very old-school Game & Watch inspired design but suffused with much more modern capabilities. I've been trying to make this video for a while now and not really been getting anywhere. Why? Well, paralysis of choice. The DS library is huge and diverse and it's been a struggle to pick out a reasonable number of games for a video like this. So this is absolutely not a definitive list of the most limit-pushing DS games or the best DS games. It's just some DS games, a selection that's push the limits. Also, these games aren't the easiest to fit onto any sort of screen that isn't a DS, so, well, I'll just have to muddle through, and let's start with Ridge Racer DS. A launch title from 2004, one of the very first games out of the gate, and one that was probably supposed to send quite a strong message about the new console and the direction that it was heading in. A very colourful arcade racer that also helped to launch another console, the original PlayStation, a decade earlier. Namco's Ridge Racer was a revolutionary and massively influential arcade game when it launched in 1993, the first major game of any type to be done entirely in texture-mapped 3D polygons. So when the PlayStation debuted just a year later with a very fine home-com version of it, it left no one in any doubt what the machine's capabilities were and what it was all about. A massive leap from the previous generation, new technology that could handle the latest in 3D. So this port of Ridge Racer on the DS, done by Nintendo themselves, was, I'm sure, a callback to that launch. They wanted to send the same message about the DS and its own leap forward. And in fact, apart from the lower resolution necessitated by the DS's LCD screen, it honestly probably looks better than the PS1 version, with better textures, better draw distance and less of the glitchiness that was so characteristic of PS1 games. It also has some nice reflection effects on the player's car, not really a true reflection of the actual scene, but a little boost of visual flair that the PS1 version lacked. It even shows the lights when you go into a tunnel, very nice. This also links to the N64 because this is not just a straight port of the original game, but a version of Ridge Racer 64 with all the extra content that that version had. Another hint at what the DS was perhaps planned to be, though in the end not that many other N64 games got ported. As impressive as this is, the thunder of this big moment was stolen a bit by Sony, whose PlayStation Portable launched nearly simultaneously with its own version of Ridge Racer, one that looks better than the DS version. There's really no comparison. It looks absolutely amazing for a 20-year-old handheld game. Yes, of course, the DS had plenty of other points in its skill tree that helped it prosper in the end, but the PSP is also aided by an analog stick, which helps it play better than the DS version too, which was let down a bit by the controls. You can use the touchscreen as a sort of analog control, but it doesn't work that well. But let's not forget this is a launch title, and surely there were more impressive racing games released for the DS later in its life, right? Well, not massively, actually. Codemasters Grid adds a bit more realism with some slightly more lifelike graphics and some nice particle effects too. It does lack the reflection mapping of Ridge Racer, but the car models and the scenery are a bit more detailed, and it does have some nice shadows. It's also got more content and more satisfying controls, but it's not quite the same jump forward as, say, Gran Turismo was from the PlayStation Ridge Racer. Perhaps though, racing games aren't the most fertile ground on the DS, so let's move on to another launch title that I just can't neglect, Super Mario 64 DS. Yes, this was the big one when the DS hit, Nintendo's absolute classic 3D platformer, the one that practically invented the genre now in portable form. A very exciting prospect in 2004, especially when this version has extra content and more playable characters. Yes, L is real in this one. Another showcase of what the system could do, like it was on the N64, though once again the controls aren't just right. Part of the joy of Mario 64 on the N64 was its fantastic control scheme, facilitated by the groundbreaking Trident controller with its analog stick, now all but confirmed as reverse-engineered alien technology, at least that's what they're saying on Reddit. Anyway, that is something that the DS doesn't have, and it doesn't play just quite as nicely. The touchscreen a poor substitute for that analog stick. I think if this was the only version of the game it wouldn't seem that bad, but compared to the original it's not quite there. The graphics have had a bit of an overhaul though as well, with a new, more naturalistic colour palette and more detailed textures. This was one area that the N64 struggled in, its unusual graphics processor, very powerful in some ways, but it didn't have as much room for the textures of individual polygons. The frame rate is better too, sticking more closely to 30 frames per second than the famously unoptimised N64 version ever did. In other ways, this is a bit of a downgrade, but not all that much. The resolution is lower and the polygons don't have that same smoothness that the original had. It sort of looks a bit like a PS1 version of Mario 64 with the same little flaws that PS1 visuals tended to have. This shouldn't be a surprise really, as the DS is closer to the PS1 in performance than the N64 in some key ways, though very much not in others. The DS is unusual in the way that it works. It can have at most 2048 polygons on screen per frame, and that is fixed. Not the case with most other game systems. The number isn't predetermined. You can go for a more complex scene at a lower frame rate, or simplify things if you want to keep the frame rate up. That trade-off isn't available on the DS. 2048 polygons is a hard limit, and there's other restrictions too in how things are drawn, making 3D graphics on the DS more challenging. On most other systems, including the PS1, if the scene gets a bit too complicated, well, the frame rate drops and maybe the player might never even notice if it's only briefly, but on the DS, if you have too many polygons or you get the restrictions wrong, things aren't drawn, polygons drop out and it can be much more obvious. This makes it all the more impressive that Mario 64 runs so well. Yes, it was probably the biggest launch game, the one that got the most attention, and yes, it was Nintendo themselves who ported it, but still, it was not a given that this could be so good. The models for the main characters are actually more complex than Mario was on the N64 too, going with a more updated look, so it's even more impressive that they fit all this into the DS's polygon budget without too many obvious compromises. Today, if you want to play Mario 64, well, I think the Switch port or the online emulated version is probably the way to go on the move or at home, but this version still is enjoyable, the extra content sweetening the deal. Again though, another launch title, can't I do better than that? Well, not really when it comes to 3D platformers. Let's be honest, there haven't really been many better 3D platform games on any system at all ever, let alone the DS, but anything better technically? Well, even that is not looking good. I mean, there's not much that's massively better, but there is one interesting game that I've found that is worth a look. Pack and Roll.
Pack and Roll!
A DS exclusive developed by Namco, and yes, Pac-Man is back again in, well, a sort of 3D platformer. 3D platforming with a Pac-Man spin on it, literally, because you control Pac-Man by rolling him around with the touchscreen on the bottom. Collect the dots, avoid the ghosts, navigate the world. This is more of a platform game with a twist than another reimagining of the original arcade game, but it does keep a lot of callbacks to the game's roots. Not a better game than Mario 64, of course not, but it is quite fun, and it does have one trick that Mario 64 doesn't: 3D on both screens at once. Almost. Remember that 2048 polygon limit? Well, that can be broken in one specific circumstance. You can only have 2048 polygons in any one frame at once, and you can only draw 3D graphics on one screen at once, but there's nothing to stop you switching between the screens very quickly. And that's what Pack and Roll does, updates one screen then the other, alternating between the two. The main display at the top, then the 3D display of the rolling Pac-Man, and whatever else at the bottom, one and then the other. This gives 3D graphics on both screens, albeit running at 30 frames per second at most, but honestly, that still looks fine, especially on the original quite blurry screen. Not that many games used 3D on both screens, really. Well, I say not many. In the DS's gargantuan library, there's probably quite a few, but it's not the normal way of doing things, and it's not how this next game works either, despite being very impressive in other ways. Yes, another game from another big franchise, one that I can't ignore. It's Metroid Prime Hunters. The first-person shooter-shaped Metroidvania adventure game in its handheld guise. A bit more first-person shooter than the GameCube and Wii games, but still true to form. Developed not by Retro Studios, who did the three main Metroid Prime games, but by Nintendo Software Technology, the same American Nintendo subsidiary who developed Ridge Racer DS. Not a launch title this one, though it was slated to be a fairly early release until Nintendo held it back to add online multiplayer features. Yes, alongside the touchscreen, the DS also had Wi-Fi. Totally unremarkable now, but then revolutionary. The first Nintendo console with wireless connectivity built in and ready to go. This means 4-player online death matches with voice chat. The first Nintendo game to offer such a feature, and it would be a while before they would try it again. Graphics wise, this game does look superb, well designed technically and artistically, capturing the look and feel of the GameCube games that this was launched in the wake of. A slight downgrade, but still good. Again, the PS1 might come to mind with these graphics. One thing both systems have is a bit of polygon jitter due to the lack of floating point precision. This leads to polygons that jump around a bit as the camera moves, so it never seems to look quite so bad on the DS as it does on the PS1. The DS also has better texture mapping too, with more accurate perspective of the textures on the polygon surfaces. Again, it's going to be really hard on the DS to find a first-person shooter game that beats this gameplay-wise, but perhaps there is one game that edges it out a bit visually. From 2009, it's Moon. Developed by Renegade Kid, it's one of 4 impressive DS games they created, but this one definitely shows some inspiration from Metroid Prime. Not that that is a bad thing. Yes, it's a sci-fi first-person shooter with exploration at its core, but it's maybe a bit more linear than Metroid. The controls are very similar too, a D-pad to move and the touchscreen used like a mouse to look. I think it works okay, but that's a problem that some people may have had with both this and Metroid. Shoot is mapped to the left shoulder button, which does feel a bit awkward, but, well, less awkward than any other button it could have been mapped to. The graphics go further than Metroid does, with some minor but noticeable visual effects, lots of coloured lights for a start. This is something that the DS supports in hardware, although it's not anything like modern complex lighting. It can just add a coloured gradient to textures known as Garou shading. Yes, your shots light up the room, and flashing lights, well, they flash coloured light. A nice effect, but it doesn't include shadows. In fact, this whole game seems to be shadow-free. Another effect that gets shown off a bit is multi-layered translucent textures, like these pipes here, which add a bit of movement and depth to the setting. The DS didn't see the same progression in 3D graphics that other systems did in the same era. Comparing early and late PS1 and PS2 games, the difference can be huge. Not so much in earlier and later DS games. Partly, I think, because the sort of standard definition 3D polygon based graphics that the DS was good at was pretty well understood by developers at this point. No one really knew what they were doing with the PS1 in 1994, the way it worked was so new, but by 2004 how to do this stuff was better understood. But that's the big thing about the DS, it just wasn't about graphics technology for the most part. It offered a whole range of new experiences, new types of games that were not possible on other systems. The DS was a bit different, so let's try and look at some more uniquely DS games, ones that make use of its unique features, like Contra 4. Yes, a real old-fashioned 2D action game, and it does what not many DS games of any type did and expands the playfield across both screens, making for a game with an unusually tall aspect ratio. The two screen displays aren't contiguous either, there's a gap between them like they're two viewing windows on a full scene. When something leaves the top screen it doesn't immediately appear on the bottom one, there's a little gap like it's travelling in the space between them, a nice touch. Published by Konami but developed by WayForward Technologies, the same people who developed the amazing Shantae games, this is authentic 2D action, real old school 2D is what's going on here, tile-based graphics with backgrounds and sprites. As well as 3D, the DS also has classic 2D capabilities built in. You could really call it the Super NES. Its 2D hardware is an expanded version of the Game Boy Advance's PPU graphics chip, itself a sort of souped up Super NES PPU, which of course drew from the original NES. Nearly every other console since the PS1 has ditched tile-based 2D and does 2D graphics with flat polygons. The end result in many cases can end up looking the same, but the development process won't be. And that probably explains part of the DS's massive success, the fact that developers could make 2D games the old-fashioned way if they wanted to. This might be the most old school 2D game of them all on the DS though, it really does go hard on the classic run and gun action, and it looks absolutely incredible throughout. Visually a worthy successor to any of the dense pixel art arcade games that this is an homage to and continuation of. Even the aspect ratio is authentic, as both the original Contra and Super Contra in the arcade had vertically oriented monitors. It is brutally difficult though, painful even compared to previous Contra outings which were never easy to begin with. Contra 4 did appear on other platforms, notably Android and iOS, but with a different aspect ratio. No other version could ever be quite like the DS original. This next game though never appeared anywhere else, and it's very difficult to imagine how it could work on anything but the DS without major surgery. Let's take a look at Ninja Gaiden Dragon Sword. Another interesting aspect ratio, because this game demands you turn your DS on its side like you're holding a book, with the two screens in a vertical orientation. Living manga seems to be the aim for this game, art come to life, underlined by the controls being entirely driven by the stylus on the touchscreen like you're drawing the action yourself. Of course, a lot of DS games made use of the touchscreen, most games used it in some capacity, but often it felt like a bit of a pointless distraction, something tacked on for the sake of it, but here, well, it does feel justified, at least as an interesting experiment. A continuation of the original Ninja Gaiden series from the NES, but this isn't vintage pixel art, but a hybrid of rendered 2D backgrounds and polygon-based characters. Team Ninja, who developed this, are a Japanese studio, but one aimed at developing games that would appeal to Western audiences. So this is full of ninja tropes, but packaged in a very accessible way. These days, Neo is perhaps what this team is best known for, but it's hard to ignore the influence of their Ninja Gaiden games, of which Ninja Gaiden Dragon Sword stands as a very worthy member. Most of all, this is a great DS game. It's got the features of what made the console stand apart from everything else. Inventive modern gaming. This isn't just a console game in portable form, but something tailored to the system that it's on, something that makes use of the system's unique strengths. But that's the legacy of the DS. So many companies really went all out making games for it. How could they resist trying to inject themselves into its massive success? But I think probably the games that really inhabit the system the best come from the big N themselves, as is often the case with Nintendo consoles. It's their baby, they know how to wring the most out of it, and on the DS we were blessed with two huge first-party games from the same series that did just that. So yes, it's time for a look at The Legend of Zelda, starting with The Phantom Hourglass. The intro sets the scene, spread across both screens. Zelda openings have always been great, and this one, as usual, is not just a tease, but leads to a game that is equally pleasing. And it's classic Zelda in a sense, but also a little bit different. Previously, the series had of course been in either 2D like the first few games and handheld releases, or all new 3D from the Ocarina of Time onwards in the main series. Phantom Hourglass is, well, it's a bit of both. The towns and dungeons are all 3D polygons, but from a mostly fixed top-down view, giving a more classic 2D Zelda feel, with occasional angle shifts for dramatic effect. Sailing the high seas, the game's overworld is all fully 3D though, and nicely atmospheric. Yes, this is a direct sequel to the GameCube's Wind Waker, and sailing plays a big part in the adventure, but the game does do a good job of recreating the same look on more limited hardware. The control method is a bit different this time. It's now stylus based, and we don't have to worry about the wind either because this boat is steam powered. Another thing retained from the Wind Waker is the cell shading or toon shading animation style, the thing that really sets this era of Zelda apart from the others. A bit blockier than the GameCube with lower resolution, but it's still got that look, especially prominent in cutscenes with close-ups. This is an adaptation of the usual lighting method used in 3D engines at the time, but instead of using a continuous gradient of colour, it's got it in hard bands. This capability is built into the DS's GPU. Yes, Nintendo made the DS with this style in mind. One of a few advanced DS graphical features that didn't get all that much use. What's missing though is the shadows. Yes, in this game they're just black blobs on the floor, not the proper shadow mapping with light sources seen on the GameCube. A thoroughly great game all the way through though. Where this fits exactly on the Zelda tier list, well, opinions differ, but it holds up to the unwavering standard of quality that Nintendo have a lock on for this franchise. The companion to the Phantom Hourglass, based on the same game engine I'm pretty sure, is Legend of Zelda Spirit Tracks. Actually the third in the Wind Waker series really. This is set 100 years after the Phantom Hourglass, and another incarnation of Link sets off through another incarnation of Hyrule, this time on a train. Looking back now, the whole DS era seems a bit weird, but at the time the two-screen design and the offbeat games that it birthed became normalised through sheer popularity, and everyone forgot how strange it all was. The maximum oddness of the era though, surely embodied by Spirit Tracks. Zelda meets Train Simulator. I mean, this is a very fine game. It got good reviews at the time. It's not everyone's favourite Zelda. I'm sure it's someone's, but it really is a trip though. A sort of gentle, bucolic steampunk is the vibe, and in most respects it looks and plays just as well as its predecessor. But maybe not all respects though, because the train sections here do show up the weaknesses of the DS's 3D graphics more than the high seas in the Phantom Hourglass did. I think it's probably the distances involved, the size of the world and the complexity of the train model that probably limits the number of polygons that can be used for the scenery, and it does show. But this is a fairly minor thing to complain about, really. Otherwise, this game is absolutely fabulous, loaded with so much of what always makes this series appealing, and with some of its own inventive new twists too. I would say that this is the DS at its wacky, unexpected best, but if this incarnation of Zelda doesn't grab you, well, the DS is hardly short of alternatives. Yes, Nintendo gave us plenty more to play, including Pokemon, and more Pokemon, but also the DS saw New Super Mario Bros., Animal Crossing, Nintendogs, and many more. Other developers gave it full send too on the DS as well, giving us Ace Wright, Professor Layton, Brain Training, the return of so many classic series, Castlevania, Final Fantasy, Dragon Quest, maybe the definitive version of Chrono Trigger. The DS seems limitless. With most consoles, once you get out of the top 50, certainly the top 100 games, the bottom of the barrel heaves into view, but the DS keeps great if overlooked games coming and coming. The thing is though, the DS didn't become the battleground for a graphics technology arms race in the way that many other consoles did. It broke out of that mould and became about something else. An arms race to be inventive, do different things with the technology it had available, or at least update old ideas to fit it. So maybe it's counter to the spirit of the DS to look for the most technically impressive games. This was a console that sidestepped all of that. I'm not going to let that stop me though, it is what I do, and well, surely if we're going in that direction, the hotspot for the most impressive games for the past 20 years on any system has been the open world, and that leaves the question, what is the best proper open world game on the DS? Are there any even? Well, there is one that definitely does spring to mind, that's Grand Theft Auto Chinatown Wars. From 2009, again a big year for the DS, slightly abstract, toon-shaded 3D polygons with a bit of a comic book look make up this world, but with an overhead viewpoint that makes this another DS example of the halfway house between 2D and 3D. Gameplay-wise though, this definitely falls fairly firmly into the 3D universe of Grand Theft Auto with a complex narrative-driven storyline. Right from the start, the touchscreen is brought into the action, but thankfully most of the main game controls are with the D-pad and buttons for a more straightforward console-like feel. But most of all, this is unmistakably a Grand Theft Auto game, red in tooth and claw. It might be from an oblique angle, but all the chaos and craziness is there. Rated 18 in the UK and M in the USA, the graphical style and just the smallness of the screen make this less graphic than other GTA games, but the content itself has not been watered down in any significant way. In fact, the drug-dealing side missions drew their own fair share of controversy when this game was originally released. Set in Liberty City, the map isn't quite as large as some incarnations of it have been, but it still feels pretty huge. There's no shortage of content, and it's all laid out in the typically non-linear open world style that you'd expect, with missions and points of interest and various things for you to explore and try out. It's the look of this game though that puts it in a space all of its own. There's nothing quite like it anywhere else. Clearly the developer Rockstar Leeds had been looking at the official Nintendo developer documentation for the DS, because this uses some features built into the GPU that not many others seem to have bothered with. So it's got toon shading, yes, like in Zelda, but also edge marking, outlining not everything but cars, buildings, human beings and other prominent objects with a black comic book style outline. We've also got some smoke, particle effects, weather, and a rare feature on the DS, perhaps unique to this game, proper shadows on the people, cars and buildings that change and lengthen with the day and night cycle. You don't even see the sky in this game, let alone the sun, but you can see its effects. The DS's GPU is nothing like that found in modern systems. It's not got the programmable shader cores that are used for so many advanced effects. It is a fixed function GPU, but it does have some pre-programmed shader-like abilities built in. Chinatown Wars is one of the very few games that actually put these capabilities to much use. I suppose that most other developers must have felt that these effects might have been lost on the fairly small, fairly blurry screens of the original DS consoles. Chinatown Wars, though, I think, proves that it was worth investing time in these extra graphical fineries, at least artistically, maybe not financially. Chinatown Wars is, according to Metacritic, the highest rated game on the DS, a critical smash that ticks all the boxes. It uses the DS hardware so well, but that doesn't equal big sales. I guess parents weren't buying this controversial game for their children, and the core audience of older teens and adults may have been put off by this game's shift in viewpoint and move away from realism. The whole game is built around the top-down view, so it doesn't really get in the way. You quickly get used to it, but it will be a shock for gamers who got into GTA via San Andreas or Vice City. Even if you're a real old-school Grand Theft Auto fan, though, moving the camera a bit is still a tempting thought. It would be nice to see this world from a different viewpoint. Buried in Rockstar's vaults, there is probably an alpha build of this game that lets you do just that, but there's probably a good reason why it stays buried. Yes, a fully third-person GTA on the DS might have some compromises. In fact, it would probably look like this one last game for the list, Cop the Recruit. Created by the slightly unfortunately named VD Dev, the same team who created the insane Driver 3 port on the Game Boy Advance, so they did sort of have form for bringing impossible games to handhelds. And despite the name, this game was originally possibly intended to be part of the Driver series itself until that branding was dropped during development. It still very much fits the mould of a Driver game though. It was, after all, the Driver games that got there first with the 3D open world driving game thing, whilst Grand Theft Auto was still in 2D mode. It didn't look that great on the hardware at the time, but hey, they did it first, so it seems appropriate that what is almost a Driver game made that same leap on the DS. This is both truly impressive and slightly disappointing at the same time. It's great that they did this, it's great that they brought a game like this to the DS, but it's got its flaws. It does look better than Driver 2 on the PS1, marginally, but the short draw distance, the low poly models and the ugly jagged lines make this look rough. That's not to say this game doesn't have some impressive attention to detail. Shadows don't really exist in this world, but light sources and reflections do. Yes, all the cars are lit by presumably the sun, and the windows all seem to be showing some sort of reflections too. In fact, I think it's the skybox texture projected onto the glass of car windscreens, and in fact most of the windows in the game. All the buildings' windows reflect that sky too, which is a nice touch and something even a lot of modern games don't bother with. There's no day and night cycle per se, but certain missions do take place at different times and you do get some nice shifts in the colour palette and lighting to reflect that. There's even some snow in one of the early missions and slippery car handling to go with it. In other respects though, this game feels fairly unfinished, with lots of bits missing. There's very little physics, you just warp into cars rather than being shown getting into them, and there seems to be no damage to vehicles either. It looks like game development was curtailed halfway through and it just got pushed out the door, with the Driver branding stripped out. Ubisoft, the publisher, must have lost confidence in it and it was never really finished. You don't even get chased by the police. I don't want to hate on this game too much though. The developers obviously gave it a good go, but well, maybe the DS just isn't powerful enough to pull something like this off, or at least not pull this off to a standard that was acceptable in 2009. The capabilities of the PSP is perhaps the elephant in the room here. Never have two consoles launched at the same time in direct competition ever been so mismatched. The PSP was a generation ahead of the DS in terms of raw power. Liberty City Stories and Vice City Stories on the PSP are real full-on 3D open world GTA games with very few compromises. Telling that they were developed by the same Rockstar leads that came up with Chinatown Wars. They could have made these games for the DS, and they didn't, probably because they knew it wouldn't work so well. Of course, the DS outsold the PSP by quite a way. Graphical performance wasn't the key in this race because the DS was a generation ahead in innovation. The PSP's elevator pitch was slightly downgraded PS2 games with more cramped controls, but the DS was offering brand new experiences. Cooking Mama might be kryptonite for hardcore gamers, but you've got to admit it's original. Maybe there's still some graphical potential in the DS that remains untapped. This fantastic fan-made tech demo of Super Mario Galaxy hints at that. Seems like this might even be able to overcome the polygon limits with some clever tricks. But the DS though, ultimately its long life became about much more than just graphical prowess. It did things differently. So here we are at the end, once again, the mighty DS. There's so many games on this system, I know I've not even scratched the surface. And I'm not trying to knock the PSP either, that was wonderful in its own way, especially in terms of homebrew where it did a bit better than the DS. So last orders at the bar now. Thank you once again to my wonderful Patreons. Your help is much appreciated, and if anyone out there would like to join them and help me out a bit, there is a link below. It does make a huge difference. And I will say thanks for watching and goodbye.